I thought I'd start off this session by giving a brief overview of where we are in the pandemic scientific-wise. As Mary Ev mentioned, I just thought I'd declare my conflict of interest. I'm the CEO of CANImmunize, which is a digital immunization software company. So as many of you are aware, we're now in the fourth wave, and this is being driven by the Delta variant. And as we've unfortunately seen the stories across the country, it's affecting different regions of the country differently. Fortunately, so far, Ontario is looking pretty good, but unfortunately, out west in Alberta and BC, they are having a much greater struggle with this. The fourth wave is predominantly affecting the unvaccinated, though we're now starting to see some breakthrough cases in vaccinated individuals. But I'd like to go back to this slide. There's some very good news with how we've been battling the pandemic so far. The mRNA vaccines that were created at the outset of the pandemic, that were worked on at the outset of the pandemic, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are truly remarkable in their effectiveness. We're referring to this in an immunization moon landing. These are the graphs from the New England Journal when they were first published and showing 95% effectiveness. And we don't see graphs like this in medicine often. This is quite a remarkable accomplishment when they were developed and first evaluated. But now we're starting to see things have started to change somewhat. The virus we're dealing with, the Delta variant, is more infectious. The reproduction number, which is a measure of the number of individuals who are infected for each individual initially infected, has approximately doubled from the original version to the Delta variant. The effectiveness of the vaccination is now different in two ways. One is it's not quite as effective as it was initially. The 95% effectiveness was quite remarkable, and we're down to now an 80% effectiveness rate. And we're also seeing the type of immunity it's providing is changing. Initially, the vaccine was providing what we called sterilizing and protective immunity. The sterilizing immunity is when it prevents against infection in individuals completely, so these individuals cannot transmit the virus. It's still doing so at a pretty good rate at about 80%, but the vaccine was actually designed to provide protective immunity to protect against serious disease, and it's continuing in that regards now. That's at about 95%. So what are the implications of this? We are now seeing some breakthrough infections in vaccinated individuals, but fortunately, so far, they are not getting very sick. But these vaccinated individuals, though, can be minimally symptomatic and now carry the virus. And this is obviously of concern to those who are not vaccinated because they now can get potentially infected from a vaccinated individual. I thought I'd briefly talk about some epidemiologic concepts here. So first, the idea of herd immunity. We've been hearing this referred to a lot in the public and discourse, and we're hearing different numbers being thrown out. So just give you a sense of where this number comes from. It's calculated by 1 minus 1 over the reproduction number divided by the vaccine effectiveness. So at the outset, the reproduction number was 2.5 and the vaccine effectiveness was 95%, as we've shown. So the herd immunity threshold was 63%. And we could obtain this through voluntary measures, and that's why there wasn't a lot of discussion of mandates at the outset. But now with the Delta variant, the reproduction number has almost doubled and the vaccine effectiveness has dipped somewhat to 80%. So now we basically need the entire population to get vaccinated to achieve herd immunity. And as we're noticing, this cannot be done through purely voluntary measures. And this figure demonstrates sort of the differences in the different variants and how infectious they are and how the vaccine protects against them. So if we look at the Delta variant, it's about twice as transmissible as the original version. And if you see with 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine or Moderna vaccine, we're still seeing 80% protection against symptomatic disease. But the good news is on the far right, we're seeing still around 96% protection against severe COVID hospitalization and death. So while there's been some dip in the sterilizing immunity, the protective immunity is remaining robust. And this is evident from what the CDC has observed in the population that's getting infected and hospitalized from the Delta variant, that there are 10 times more hospitalization and greater than 10 times more deaths from in unvaccinated compared to vaccinated individuals. So I also want to briefly discuss that even if the vaccine is not providing that 95% effectiveness, it's still incredibly important that everybody receive the vaccine, and describe sort of how a good but not perfect vaccine can reduce infections. So let's say we've achieved a 70% coverage with the mRNA vaccines. We can reduce the reproduction number from 4.6 down to around 2. And that's sort of where we were hovering around. And if we can push that up to 90%, we can reduce that reproduction number further to 1.3. And I thought I'd just sort of, all other things being equal with no other public health measures in place, demonstrate what this means. So this is the reproduction number of 2. This is a 70% coverage rate. The circle there, the cases peaking at around 4 million for Canada. And if we can get it down to 1.3, we've reduced it, the peak at around 1 million for Canada. So that's quite an impact on the total number of cases by increasing the vaccination rate by another 20%. So why do we need even stronger vaccination policies? And I think something that gets missed in all of this is the number one reason is to protect the unvaccinated. And who are those unvaccinated? Well, right now, we know it's those who can't be vaccinated, which include those under 12 years old. So a lot of school-aged children. Those whose vaccination effectiveness has dropped, and this includes older adults and the immunocompromised, and we're starting to see some waning immunity in older adults. And those who refuse to be vaccinated, and they need to be protected as well. While it may be viewed as their decision to not be vaccinated, to allow them to go into an indoor space where the virus is circulating and where we know that some vaccinated individuals could be carrying the virus is simply not safe for those individuals. These individuals are high risk and they can contract the virus, they can get sick, and we know unvaccinated individuals often congregate, so they could spread this amongst their family and colleagues. And this is a scenario we just do not want to see. We don't want to see these unfortunate individuals fall ill, and we've been hearing the tragic stories of many of them recanting in the hospitals, wishing they had made another decision. It's also important to note that even if you are infected and carry the virus asymptomatically while you're vaccinated, the duration of infectivity is decreased. So there's even further benefits to increasing vaccination rates. So this is sort of the paradox that we're seeing that the less effective a vaccine is to a certain threshold, the stronger the argument for stronger vaccination policies. So if we had the original scenario of a reproduction number of 2.5 and a 95% effective vaccine, we potentially could have gotten to where we wanted with voluntary policies. But under the current scenario, that is not really attainable, and we do need to bring in mandates of some sort. Just a few other factors. We are starting to see some waning immunity, reduced vaccine effectiveness at about 6 months after the second dose, particularly in older adults. And we're starting to see booster policies for older adults in congregate settings like long-term care. School reopening is a risk for further circulation of the virus, and because we know under 12 they're not vaccinated, we're hoping we can start getting first doses in these kids by November. And we're also keeping a close eye on the impact on the pediatric system. And here's a cautionary note from Israel. Israel brought in, had the earliest vaccination campaign, but they did reduce their other public health policies at the same time. And Canada actually was increasing their measures at the same time. And it's just important to know vaccination is absolutely essential to battling this virus, but so are other public health measures like masking and ventilation where possible. And this is what Israel saw when that happened. They saw a surge in cases while Canada was still able to keep our numbers down despite not having quite the vaccination rates at Israel at the earliest stages. And Israel also saw an increase in number of deaths as a consequence. And there are a couple of factors. One was the fact that they had reduced some of their public health policies. But this is a preprint from what they've observed with their vaccine program. And if you look on the far right on the top, the dark black bar graph are those earliest vaccinated over 60. And we're starting to see more cases in those. And then those that are more proximally vaccinated have fewer cases, showing some waning immunity. And we see that to some degree in the 40 to 60 age range. But if you look on the box on the bottom, we're still in the over 60s. This is when we're looking at severe illness. We're seeing some waning of the protective immunity over 60, but fortunately, protective immunity is being maintained in the 40 to 60-year-old age group, which explains the booster policies we're bringing in. So just going to conclude with a note of hope. The fourth wave, we are hoping won't be as bad because of protective immunity from the vaccines, but it's really important that a high percentage of individuals be vaccinated. We are seeing the virus circulate and it's likely to become endemic. And the combination of people being vaccinated and then this virus circulating will eventually provide broad protection. But again, the most important factor here is we need people to first be vaccinated so that when they are exposed, they do not become seriously ill. Vaccinating children will be critical. Boosters will provide further protection to those in whom immunity wanes. And my sense is workplaces are going to need to be vigilant for years. This may be akin to bad influenza seasons. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. We'll now move to Colleen, Dr. Flood.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. Sorry, slideshow. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Kumanan, and thank you very much to Moderator. I'm presenting this with my colleague, Bryan Thomas. So we're going to go back and forth a little bit and do ours together. And then we'll be passing the baton to our colleague, Vivek, to talk about some of the privacy questions. So what we hope to cover today at a high level are the kinds of claims that might be grounded in civil liberties against vaccine passport systems where the government puts them in place. So claims made in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or generally that's what we're going to speak to. And then we will also touch on where the private sector, so employers or others on their own steam, want to put in place requirements for proof of vaccination without a mandate from the government. So we hope to touch on both of these things, or cover both of these things today. So the goals that governments have with vaccine passports, I think it's quite important to articulate what those are. And when we come to a legal analysis, those goals are, as articulated, are quite important for testing their constitutionality or otherwise. So one of the goals, and there's a little bit of a problem here because I think there are a couple of goals that governments have. So one of the goals that we've seen from Kumanan's presentation is a goal to actually spur higher overall vaccination rates, something closer, as we've seen, closer to 100% of those who are able to be vaccinated to protect the unvaccinated, essentially, those who can't be vaccinated. And then a second goal is within specific high-risk congregate settings, so within places like gyms or bars, to reduce the risk of transmission. So those two things are a little different. And so when we consider this, sometimes I think this may be why governments might come in from some criticism, because people are looking at the rationale for government intervention in different ways. So we were thinking about this issue of vaccine certificates and passports back in January, and wondering if they would be needed, and calling on the federal government to consider putting them in place. The federal government didn't act here at that time, and what we've had instead is sort of a mishmash of provincial action. And we can sort of see then that there are differences across the country, which will be interesting to see how they play out. So if we consider, for example, the differences between Alberta and Ontario, Alberta has tried to be, I guess, more respectful of individual choice, and has permitted in lieu of vaccination that someone provide a negative test recent within 72 hours to enter certain premises. And again, if we go back to those objectives, it's sort of debatable whether that makes sense from a public health perspective, because vaccinated people, as Kumanan mentioned, are still able to transmit the virus. And so there is a danger, even with a negative test, that the unvaccinated will contract the virus in those passported settings, and potentially require hospitalization. Another interesting difference that we see here, pardon me, I hadn't finished here, is a difference in British Columbia, where British Columbia doesn't actually permit, at this stage anyway, any medical exemptions to their vaccine passport system, because their rationale is that it is unsafe for people who are unvaccinated, whether that's by choice or because of their medical circumstances, to go into these congregate settings. So I just give you these examples, both to show the kind of differences that are happening across the provinces, and perhaps because some of the differences in rationale that governments are proffering for why they are introducing the vax passport systems, and we'll see how these all play out. So the kinds of challenges that might come to pass, or likely will come to pass, against vaccine certificate systems center on things under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and other human rights and privacy legislation around claims to mobility rights, claims to liberty and security, claims to freedom of religion and conscience, claims to equality and non-discrimination, and privacy rights. We're going to cover sort of some of the first four briefly, and Vivek will speak to the privacy rights issue. So on mobility rights, under all the legal folks will know, and I'm sorry, I'm keeping this at a relatively general level. So under Section 1 of the Charter, citizens of Canada have the right to enter, remain, and leave Canada. And under Section 2, both citizens and permanent residents have the right to move to, reside in, and gain a livelihood in any province. And so early on, some worried that vaccine passports would infringe on those rights by providing a mechanism for blocking unvaccinated folks from travel. Okay, so if we look internationally, the Supreme Court of Canada has established that the central thrust of the Charter's protection for international movement is to guard against exile and banishment, the purpose of which is the exclusion of membership in the national community. We don't think that there's really a plausible scenario where vaccine passports have that effect, particularly where proof of vaccination is in substitution for things like a 2-week quarantine in your own home, or as we had before, a 3-day, in addition, a 3-day hotel stay and testing and so on. So the vaccine passports are being used in substitution for these other, I think, more rights infringing requirements. So that's at the international level. Then intra-provincially, again, we have a situation where some provinces potentially are using vaccine passports to protect their borders and protect entry from people who may be at risk of transmitting the virus. And again, we see that this is being used in substitution for other measures. So, for example, 2-week quarantine and so forth and so on. So we don't see that there likely is a tenable argument here. And moreover, over time, it would not seem that really it is in the interests of provinces to try to block travel by out-of-province travelers on using some kind of vaccine passport. I think what we have seen is, because of the mishmash of initiatives going on across the coast, is that not by design, but perhaps by accident, some folks will fall through the cracks, and this will need to be sorted out, hopefully quite rapidly. An issue that does arise and is claimed, many claim that their rights are impeded by a vaccine certificate or vaccine requirements. And one of the things we have to think about from a charter perspective is whether or not the right claimed actually rises to the level of a charter rights for even consideration. So when we are thinking about life, liberty, and security of the person, a question that we have to ask ourselves is there a right under the Constitution to go to a bar, or to go to a restaurant, or to go to a gym? And again, it doesn't seem to us that these kinds of rights necessarily would rise to the level of a charter right, even for consideration. The Supreme Court has opined that the Constitution can't be stretched to afford protection to whatever activity an individual chooses to define as central to his or her lifestyle. So, and has said that a society, for example, that extended it to whatever, a taste for fatty food, a taste for this, a taste for that, would be extending a society that extended constitutional protection to any and all such lifestyles would be ungovernable. So it doesn't seem to us that necessarily these kinds of rights would claims would emerge to be prima facie a charter right. But I'll just hand it now to my colleague Bryan to speak about religion and conscience and informed consent, and then we'll come back to explain how this would be further analysed under the charter. Bryan?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Colleen. So I want to talk a bit about the Charter right to freedom of religion and how it applies to this topic. There's been this sort of there's been a sort of vague concern from the start that some religions may object to have religious objections to vaccination, that this could possibly raise charter issues for vaccine passports. So as a sort of preliminary question, well, first of all, let's define, when under the charter, what's covered by freedom of religion. And the answer here is that actually the charter has been read extremely expansively in defining the scope of protection for freedom of religion. Essentially, any activity that a person sincerely believes is connected to their ideas of the divine is in principle subject to charter protection. So it's an extremely generous test where it's essentially sincerity is the question, so that you don't have to bring in your clergyman to explain that, to prove that your religion actually holds these tenets, that you can have a very idiosyncratic belief about your religion that only you share, and that this actually in the leading case that set this precedent that was the case. It was someone with eccentric views about what their Jewish religion required. So we have a very broad definition of what is protected under the rubric of freedom of religion. But there are some problems here for using this as an objection to vaccination passports. One is that it doesn't really look like any major religions do, in fact, object to vaccination. So that's going to be a problem. I mean, an individual will have to come in and claim that they really do have this eccentric view that isn't shared by most religions. So that seems just kind of unlikely. That it's unlikely that we're going to get challengers coming forward in this way, because it's a very minority view among religious adherents. And then, supposing such a person came forward, another problem is that the remedy that the courts would offer would be some sort of individualized accommodation. They wouldn't overturn a vaccination passport regime on these grounds. They'd build some kind of a fix into their vaccine passport system that will allow people who can sort of prove sincere religious belief to sort of swipe and get through, say. Or another way that courts might go is to say that, and they've done this in some cases, is to say that the covered areas here, the kind of non-essential services, amount more to privileges than to rights, and that this would be a reason under Section 1 of the Charter for not extending protection or accommodation. So that's for those reasons. We're pretty convinced that freedom of religion is not going to be a major obstacle here. If we could go to the next slide on conscience. Oh, you're there already. So a separate category is the Charter, as you may know, under Section 2A, protects both freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. So what about the second category? I think this is the bulk of people who haven't been vaccinated or refuse to be vaccinated. These are people who object not due to some religious view, but due to just kind of skepticism about the science, skepticism about the pharmaceutical industry or the government regulators and so on. And this freedom of conscience is a relatively underdeveloped area of charter jurisprudence, but it's pretty fair to say that the scope of freedom of conscience protection is decidedly smaller than the scope of freedom of religion protection. So the courts have generally turned down people who come to the court. There have been cases where people have come to the courts saying, I don't believe the science on seatbelts and I want an exemption under the freedom of conscience protection. And the courts have said, no, the charter does not protect this. And one of the points they fixed on is that they want these provisions of the charter to only protect comprehensive or kind of worldviews, right? They want you to have your beliefs about this activity have to be of the sort that they kind of hinge to some central, idea, your central worldview that really goes to the core of your integrity as a person, right? So a kind of one-off skepticism about seatbelts or about vaccinations is not going to qualify. The U.S. courts in the Vietnam era, the U.S. courts would allow principled pacifists an exemption, but the people who objected to the specific policy wisdom of the Vietnam War were not given exemptions. And that's illustrating the point I'm making, where you've got to have this sort of categorical worldview that holds against it, not just a kind of one-off disagreement with government about the wisdom of some particular policy. And so that's the reason. And so we've been saying this for many months, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission just a couple of days ago came out kind of echoing this, or not echoing, but sort of reiterating this point that this is how the sort of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience have been understood under the Charter and under provincial human rights protections. Okay, so go to the next slide, Colleen. Is that still me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so some have attempted this kind of rhetorical sleight of hand. This isn't quite drawn Canadian law, that's international law, claiming that there's something about vaccination passports that violate the Nuremberg codes. The idea here is that, as you know, the Nuremberg Code was enacted as a kind of bar against the sort of sort of involuntary medical experimentation on people. And so the line of reasoning here is that if you're going to force me to get vaccinated, then I'm going to have, if I want to get into a restaurant, then I'm going to have to go and get vaccinated against my will. These vaccines have not, or at the time, in the past months, hadn't received full authorization from Health Canada. So it's they put this spin on this where this is experimental. And so you see how people from these sort of connecting these tenuous lines between these dots, they come up with this idea that this is a violation of the Nuremberg Code. So I was reluctant even to mention this, but I'm not sure it even needs to be put in words why this argument doesn't make much sense. But obviously, for one thing, the safety and efficacy of these vaccines these are not experimental anymore. And secondly, we're not talking about holding anyone down and forcing them to take a vaccine against their will. We're talking about denying people access to gyms and movie theaters on the basis of their decision not to be unvaccinated. And there's nothing in charter law, and there's nothing in the Nuremberg Code that speaks to this even. So That's all there's to say on that. Next slide. Thanks. Okay, so the final category of concern that I want to talk about is this idea that vaccine passports would infringe people's Section 15 right to equal protection, equal benefit of the law. So there's a couple of questions we just need to ask about this. So first of all, what is the, as you probably are aware, Section 15 protects only certain traits and traits analogous to those traits. So traits like race and ethnicity and age. And what all these traits have in common is that these are sort of immutable traits, or traits that are very difficult to change, right? So, your religion is, in theory, a mutable trait, but it's at such great cost to your dignity to be forced to change your religion that we kind of categorize it with race and so on for the purpose of Section 15. So the question is there, people who do not want to get vaccinated because they're skeptical of the science and so on, that's not like these categories, right? This is a choice you're making. You could choose otherwise. Government is trying to get you to change your mind. So we don't have a principled case against trying to pressure people to change their ideas about their fears about vaccination. So it's not this. In other words, this isn't a protected class, for one thing. Except there's the one exception of people who can't be vaccinated for medical reasons, and that will have to be protected probably. But putting that aside, the kind of vaccine skepticism is not protected grounds under Section 15. And the second point is that the disadvantage imposed by vaccine passports is really no disadvantage at all if the alternative to vaccine passports is a general lockdown, right? If we have two possible worlds ahead of us, one where everybody's on lockdown and one where we have vaccination passports that allow vaccinated people to continue going indoors, those are our options. And choosing door number 2 does not disadvantage anyone because, in the no vaccine passport world, everybody would suffer that burden. So in other words, adding vaccine passports doesn't add a burden or a disadvantage, and you need a disadvantage to get a Section 15 claim through. So I'll hand it back to Colleen now, I think.
Sure. Okay, so I think we have some questions about whether or not rights claimed vis-a-vis vax passports or vax certificates would amount to a prima facie charter right. But even if they did, then there's the question of whether or not the government is able to defend an infringement of a charter right. So, for example, a right to mobility or a right to conscience using Section 1 of the Charter. And essentially, all of our legal colleagues, of course, know this, but for others that to simplify it, it essentially requires that the government show that in the circumstances that the government's response, even given the importance of the right claimed, is reasonable and proportionate in the circumstances. And so here, then, we need to go back to the context of the science of the pandemic that Kumanan presented at the beginning. And so just to reiterate some of that, that as the effectiveness of the vaccine has waned in terms of reduction of transmission, that means that, ironically, we need more people vaccinated. So folks who are opposed to vaccination say, look at, this so-called vaccine, wonder vaccine is not so wondrous. It's not really working that well. So why would you want us to have it as well? But it's because of the fact that it isn't working as well on transmission that we need more people vaccinated, not less. So this is a bit of a paradox in the science. And it is these facts, we think, that would justify the use of any court challenge, would justify the use of a vaccine certificate system at this time, at this moment in the pandemic. And so the people at risk right now are the kids under 12, as we discussed, the elderly, for whom, as we saw in Israel and we see from the science, for whom their immunity may be waning now if they were vaccinated earlier in the pandemic. And so the risk of breakthrough transmission is higher, and the possibility of an unfortunate outcome is also higher. And then the people whose needs for healthcare are being delayed, denied, because the ICUs, the hospitals are so engaged with the immediacy of the need to save the lives of people with COVID-19, the vast proportion of whom are unvaccinated. And then there are those who have chosen to be unvaccinated themselves, as we've said. So this kind of, more paternalistic worry about the unvaccinated themselves, which makes it I think a little bit more difficult from a legal perspective to argue that. But of course, there are these community or societal effects, which are all relevant to how a court will view and dispose of any challenge to a vaccination certificate regime. And then I think, as Bryan has pointed out, it is not as if the question is of a Vax Pass certificate requirements and just business as normal, as life as normal. That's not what the trade-offs are. The trade-offs are, unless we're able to control the pandemic at this point, then we will, as we see in Alberta and in other places where this hasn't happened, we have to move back to lockdowns. We have all the collateral damage that is associated with the precautionary measures, non-clinical measures such as unemployment and business failure, treatment delayed or denied, unable to support somebody in long-term care, the mental health effects of loneliness and isolation, and worries about increased domestic violence, and so forth and so on. So these are all negative things. These all impact our civil liberties and other human rights in different kinds of ways. And these are all things, I think, that the court, according the disposition of any of these kinds of challenges, would be very wary of. And I think, people who are opposed to vaccine certificates, no one wants to have vaccine certificates in place. But there is this concern that this is a slippery slide to some sort of dystopian future of surveillance and so on. I think the best practices in designing a vaccination certificate program are to have a sunset clause on them. And we see that in a number of jurisdictions where, it is built in that they will expire in X number of months. And then, the government would have to, evaluate it and make the argument for it again. So in my view, the best practices are to have that kind of sunset clause. But I think the politics of it are so that nobody wants this. Actually, we only want it for the purposes of controlling the pandemic. Once the pandemic, or once COVID-19 is able to shift from pandemic to endemic, then we will be able to move past this phase where there is a need for vaccine certificates. So now I'll hand it back to Bryan to speak on from the perspective of the private sector, so where the private sector might act on its own accord without requirements from the government to require proof of vaccination.
Yeah, so there's kind of two scenarios here. So we had a kind of longer term interest in this question because we were, as provinces like Ontario were sort of signaling that they were not going to implement vaccine passports. We started thinking, well, maybe this could get done just on the steam of the private sector on its own. And so we wanted to look at that sort of question, the legalities of that question. And so there are really two questions here. One is whether employers can require their employees to be vaccinated. And the second is whether businesses can require their patrons to be vaccinated. So let me just talk about both of them. So on the question of whether workplace vaccination mandates, the legality of workplace vaccination mandates, there's not a huge amount of jurisprudence on this, and most of what is there is from the healthcare sector, where there's kind of special needs, or special, urgency to having people vaccinated. But generally, the general rule here, and especially in unionized workplaces, is a reasonableness test, right? So the labor arbitration boards will look at the sort of needs within the specific workplace and ask, is it reasonable to require people to be vaccinated in this context? And what jurisprudence we have from the healthcare sector, the courts have, or the tribunals have generally upheld vaccination requirements in these contexts. So that bodes well for the feasibility of private sector vaccination mandates. Of course, here the same some of the same restrictions will apply in the sense of human rights protections, so that you will need to have some kind of accommodations for people who cannot be vaccinated for medical reasons. But now that we have in certain provinces, in Ontario, for example, now that we've sort of delineated the tiny category of people who qualify for those exemptions, that is I think that's a relatively minor consideration, and it's a fairly clear-cut one. Like, employers will know what they need to get in terms of medical documentation for this. So I think this is a pretty lawyers will still labor lawyers are still talking about this as though it's in the realm of speculation, but I think we've come a long way towards recognizing that vaccination mandates can withstand legal challenge in many contexts. So next slide, Colleen.
Sure, sorry, apologies.
Oh, actually, the next one after that. Thanks. So what about contexts where, so in our present context where Ontario has not required vaccination passports for, say, barbershops? Can a barbershop on its own volition just start checking vaccine passports? Here again, I don't see any reason why they can't. I mean, these are private businesses who have, they can have a no shirt, no shoes rule. They can have, and the only legal obstacles here again would just be human rights legislation. So they may have to have some accommodation, or probably need to have some accommodation for medical exemptions. There may be some tenuous cases that could be made in terms of religious exemptions. And then there are potential exemptions under privacy law. But again, I would say these are minor cases. And the general gist of this is that this looks like there's really not much of a legal obstacle to the private implementation of vaccine passports in jurisdictions that don't have them, and the kind of, businesses that aren't covered by the scope of, say, Ontario's vaccine passport regime can nevertheless kind of exceed the requirements of the law and start checking vaccine passports themselves if they so desire, and with these minor caveats I've listed. Thanks. Colleen, you're next.
Did you want to conclude, Brian, or did you want me?
You go ahead.
Okay.
So
I can. So I think we as you've seen there, there has been a lot of debate and discussion across the country about the wisdom of vaccine certificates and vaccine requirements. I think part of what we are concerned about is that by not preparing the ground for this in a deliberate way, that federal and provincial governments have now kind of scrambled at this sort of final moment, really, before we were looking at a fourth wave and further lockdowns and restrictions and school closures. And we would have liked to have seen it more adroitly deployed, more thoughtfully deployed from the get-go. We think there's still potentially a role here for the federal government to provide the infrastructure of a vaccine passport that might be used internationally to be used domestically as well, for those provinces that are still thinking about the implementation of a vaccine passport, and perhaps to set some best standards about their use. So here we have the beaver. The beaver is us, my friends, and all of this. So with that, Marie-Ève, I'd like to hand it over to Vivek for the final the baton and the relay.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie-Ève. I will just start sharing my slides here. Hopefully everyone can see them. So I'd like to begin by thanking the Center for Health Law Policy and Ethics and the Center for Law Technology Society for organizing this, and Marie-Ève for moderating. So I'm going to speak about the privacy implications of vaccine passports. as they've come to be known. Unfortunately, there's an interesting comment in the Q&A about could we call them something different, and marketing would be good, but that's what they're called, so I'll stick with that term here. So in this presentation, I'm going to do three things. One is to just give you a very, very quick introduction to privacy law. Second is to do a bit of a privacy law analysis of vaccine passports. And then the third is to look at this more from a data security perspective. So privacy law in a nutshell. I teach a full semester class on privacy law, so I apologize for the very summary nature of this, but I think it's a good level set. So let's start, and let's recognize that privacy is a human right. It's protected in international law, it's protected in Canadian law. And it's like all other rights, not an absolute right. It is subject to reasonable limitation. And in the international, this is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says that you are protected against arbitrary interference with your privacy. Well, what makes interference non-arbitrary is that it's lawful, has to be according to some kind of law, necessary, there needs to be an important social goal we're trying to achieve by interfering with your privacy, and whatever interference happens has to be proportionate. So here in Canada, like in most other countries, we kind of have two big branches of privacy law. One is the constitutional law, which is really the search and seizure, when the police want to search your house for evidence of crime. The other is sort of the statutory law that Parliament and provincial legislatures pass that protect our data privacy. So I'm going to focus on that because that's what's relevant here. And most data protection law in Canada and much of the world kind of has three big components to it, right? The first is scope. What does it cover? Well, it covers the collection, the use, the retention, and the sharing of personal data. So what's personal data? It's data about a person. So my date of birth, my eye color, the fact that I'm a tea drinker, all of that is personal data. It's data about me. Aggregate population statistics are not personal data. So the rule is that if you want to collect personal data, you want to use it, you want to store it, or you want to give it to someone else, in general, you need my consent. That's the default rule. And my consent is not usually enough. You need to have a good reason to have it, a legitimate purpose to use the argot of privacy law, right? So if McDonald's wants to collect my eye color because they want to give me a Happy Meal that matches my eye color, not really a legitimate purpose. You need to have a better reason than that. So the general rule is that you need my consent to collect that information or to use it or share it, but there are exceptions. For example, public health could be an exception to that rule of consent. Okay, so here in Canada, we have a federal system of government. So privacy law, we have both federal and provincial privacy laws. And we have a structure of privacy law here, unlike in Europe, say, where we have different laws that cover the public sector and the private sector. So we have a federal private sector law, PIPEDA. We have a federal privacy act that governs the government, and we have provincial analogs to all of this. Health privacy sits at the intersection of all of this. Why is that? Well, part of the reason is that health information is all over the place, right? We have public and private entities that deal with health information, and there are federal and provincial regulatory roles in dealing with it. So for those of you who have an Apple Watch, the Apple Watch, like many other wearables, collects health data about you. When Apple is acting in its private sector capacity, the private sector laws apply. But what if your doctor says, hey, wear this watch because I think you may have an arrhythmia? It then goes into the healthcare system, and specific laws might apply depending on what you're in. Or you're an immigrant, you want to come to Canada. You need to have a medical examination to get your immigration visa. The federal government might have it, right? In the travel context, they might collect that data. So again, it's very hard to figure out which law applies, and it's a bit of a situational analysis. Okay, so that was a breakneck tour through privacy law. So with that background, how do we think about the privacy implications of vaccine passports? So let's go back to our summary of the law, right? The basic structure is data protection law protects us when our personal data is being collected or used, retained or disclosed, right? And again, consent is the default rule. You need to have a good purpose to engage in any of that behavior, and whatever you're doing has to be proportionate. So here in Ontario, the enactment of the regulation that mandates verification of proof of vaccination has answered this question of legitimate purpose for a lot of places. You need to show proof of vaccination to go to a restaurant or a nightclub or a casino, right? So those entities have a legitimate purpose in asking to see your vaccination, your proof of vaccination, right? There's a question about whether that's true for other kinds of entities where there's no mandate right now. Now, Bryan spoke about the larger legal picture when it comes to, say, an employer who asks for proof of vaccination or mandates vaccines for their employees. So we do an employment law analysis. And once you sort of complete that analysis, there's a bit of a privacy law piggyback there. So if you mandate the vaccine and you have a good reason to mandate it for your employees, well, then the question is, how much do you need to know about their vaccination status? Do you just need to look at it, or do you need to retain it for some reason? So that's kind of a secondary analysis. But let's sort of dive deeper on that, right? So privacy data protection law, again, it covers four things, right? The collection, that's like I'm looking at the thing, right? I've collected the information, I'm using it. So I'm the bouncer at the door. I'm using it to decide if you're in or out. But then there's a separate question of, do I keep the information? Do I retain it? And under what conditions, if I retain it, might I give it to someone else? So this brings us a bit more into the kind of the technicalities of proof of vaccination, right? And there are two basic ways that we can show that we're vaccinated. One is the paper vaccine record that we might have a receipt, or you can now go to the Ontario government website and print out your official vaccination receipt, or these QR codes on these apps that are being deployed, notably in Quebec, and we know an app is coming in Ontario. So these both kinds of proof, right, encode some sensitive personal data, right? They have our name in there, our date of birth, maybe they have our health card number. They certainly have the dates that we received the vaccines. They might have the kind of vaccine you received or the lot number. So there's sensitive data in there. So wearing my legal hat, I have an answer for you, which is that the regulations in Ontario, as in other Canadian provinces that are doing this, stipulate that businesses that are mandated to verify proof of vaccination for purposes of entry, they can't retain that information, right? And if they do, so they can only collect and use it by law. They cannot retain or share it further, right? If they do, there are some pretty severe penalties. So an individual could be fined up to $100,000 for non-compliance with the regulations, spend a year in jail, and the penalty for a corporation could be up to $10 million. So that should give you some comfort from a legal perspective, but there's more to the story than that. There's also the question of how secure is all of this, right? So as I noted, all the regulations in Canada right now allow you to use paper proof of vaccination, but the movement is clearly towards the use of QR codes, whether they are on paper or carried in a smartphone app, right? And a QR code, all it really is, it looks like a bunch of dots, but it's just a way of encoding information so that it's machine readable, right? So you could use an app and then see what's inside the QR code, right? You could turn this into a string of text, which stores various things, right? So we don't have the app here in Ontario. We can talk a little bit about the experience in Quebec. So in Quebec, the way they've designed their app is pretty smart. So there's two apps. There's the app that you have as the person who's vaccinated that has your little QR code. And then there's the verification app. So if you go to a bar in Gatineau, they can use the app to validate your QR code. The way they've designed this, and there's some really interesting mathematics underlying this, is that the validation app, the verification app, reads the QR code and can say whether it's genuine or not. And it can do that without pinging a centralized database or anything. And it's also designed not to collect information. So the verification app just looks at it and says, yes or no, right? And here's this display, right? Green, this is a good QR code. You are vaccinated. Red, this is a forgery, right? So data doesn't get transmitted to the government or stored in a centralized database. That's great because it means that you can't, the system has been designed to prevent tracking. So one of the big concerns with these proof of vaccination schemes is that they could be used as sort of a backdoor to create a location tracking and locational surveillance system. We should always be on guard against those kinds of possibilities of misuse, but what's happening here is there's some privacy by design. So this is a term that's used by scholars and engineers to talk about, designing technologies to protect and enhance privacy, right? So in the Quebec case, we have the use of some smart design so that there's only collection and use that's possible. You can just verify, but you can't retain the information any further. Now, of course, there's always the possibility of misuse, right? Someone with malicious intent could try to collect this information, right? And it could be used to, privacy analyst at the time the Quebec app was unveiled, talked about the possibility that, someone could create a fake verification app and use that to steal people's data. And that actually happened. Someone created a fake verification app and loaded it to the Google store. Google took it down. Now, that's certainly true. We need to be careful about that, right? So the idea here is that you create a fake app and you give the bouncer at the door the fake app. And if you're a bad person, you just scan all these QR codes and retain them. And then you can read the person, collect the person's name and date of birth. And that's sensitive information that could be used for identity theft. The question we have to ask, though, is what's the risk of that happening? And when you think about risk, we can think about how likely is the harm and what's the magnitude of the harm if we experience it, right? So on the magnitude, I mean, it would be bad, right? If our date of birth and name are correlated and exposed, right? You could use that to impersonate someone. But I think the likelihood of this happening, notwithstanding what happened over the weekend with the fake app, is low. And there's a few different reasons for that. The first is that if you're and one of the things you need to think about in security analysis is what's called threat modeling, right? If you're a bad actor, what are you going to do if you want to go and engage in identity theft? Well, you're probably not going to do, it depends on your motivations, but there's a lot of data about us that's already leaked. So if you're a large-scale criminal enterprise, you're not going to bother with collecting these QR codes when you can just go to the shadier corners of the internet and, for example, get the 9.2 million records from Desjardins Financial that were leaked in a data breach, right? And you probably have more information that way. So, it's probably not the best way of doing it. But the other thing we need to think about in thinking about the privacy risks of vaccine passports is weighing that against the background conditions of digital life today. Shoshana Zuboff is a Harvard Business School professor who's talked about the so-called surveillance capitalism business model of large technology companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon, and also credit reporting bureaus like Equifax, right? These are companies that hoover up data about us, collect data on everything we do online and in real life using phones, et cetera, and then use that to market information to us, right? So let's take the location tracking risk of the vaccine passport app in Quebec, for example, which has been designed not to enable tracking. And let's compare that to the information that your cell phone carrier knows about you, like Bell or Telus. They know everywhere you're going because that's part of what they do. They store that information, right? But what's much more pernicious than that is that the apps that we often have on our cell phone request permission to track our locations, right? And we often say yes to that for convenience, right? We want Google Maps to give us better directions. So we say, yeah, I'll let Google track my location. So one of the ways of thinking about this is, yes, there is a risk that we have to be aware of a slippery slope with vaccine passports. But the situation when it comes to data privacy, the background conditions are so bad that the risk of the passports is much lower than, frankly, the risks that many of us have already accepted when we've gone to restaurants recently. So many of you, if you've been to a restaurant recently or you've gone to a gym and you've checked in using a QR code, well, those QR codes are tied to the surveillance capitalism industry. So the ACLU in the United States did an analysis of this and found that these menu and check-in QR codes are tied to this infrastructure of location tracking, of profiling, et cetera, that big tech runs. And if we think that this is, we should be scared of what big tech is doing. In fact, these kinds of tracking networks are so scary that the American National Security Establishment, the CIA and the NSA in the US, has blocked this on their own networks because they think it's a terrible threat, right? So I think at the end of the day, what we need to think about here is, the debate about vaccine passports and privacy is a good one to have, and we should be attentive to it. And I'm happy to see that the apps that have been developed so far are actually very respectful of our privacy, and they've been designed in a smart way. So we should continue to have that debate. But I think the focus, the inordinate focus on that, is obscuring the much larger scandal of what's going on with big tech, right? And the pervasive tracking and information collection that's happening in our society, all for profit, right? So the small amount of privacy that we arguably give up in using these vaccine passport systems to prevent a deadly pandemic from killing people, right, needs to be put into context versus what we give up all the time just to make large technology companies more profitable. So I'm going to stop there, and I think I hand it back to Marie-Ève.
Thank you, Professor Krishnamurthy. Thank you all for those very interesting presentation. We already have lots of questions in the Q&A. Many of them were actually answered directly by the panelists as others were speaking. I'll send a first question to maybe Vivek, you can stop sharing your screen so we can just see all the panelists at once. Perfect, thank you. So the first question refers to something that was mentioned quickly by Colleen Flood. Given that health is a shared jurisdiction under the Constitution Act, with the federal government having jurisdiction over all sorts of things, including emergency, quarantine, criminal law, and areas of national interest, what role do you think the federal government should play in relation to vaccine passports in Canada? So maybe expand on some of the things that you mentioned, or if others have something to add to that.
Sure. If anyone wants to jump in, obviously the federal government has a role in creating the infrastructure to permit Canadians to travel internationally. And then as we start to, as we're opening up to safely allow visitors here. So all of that infrastructure is clearly under federal jurisdiction in terms of controlling our borders, direct jurisdictional control over quarantine, and these kinds of things. And in fact, one could argue that the federal government really has a duty here to provide that kind of infrastructure, because without it, Canadians will find it increasingly difficult to travel abroad, as other jurisdictions are requiring in turn this kind of evidence of vaccination, and not just that you've had the vaccination, but when you've had it and that you've had a sufficient combination to provide immunity. So clearly, internationally, the federal government needs to get this all in order a little bit more than what we currently have, which is just sort of loading up rinky-dinky kind of paper, this and that, into their app at the border. Then, there is the possibility, I think, that they could provide that infrastructure in turn to be used by provinces and that doesn't supplant or necessarily what the provinces want to do, but it would certainly make life easier for Canadians if they had one passport that or one certificate of vaccination that they could use, or at least they were interoperable. So I think if the federal governments could work with provincial governments in this regard, that would be terrific at this point, or to provide that kind of infrastructure to the provinces who want to roll it out. And then I think we've been hearing from Vivek and from us as well about some of, what are best practices. And I think, again, that federal government guidelines, if you like, about what best practices are in terms of privacy protections, what sorts of things should be within vaccine passport or requirements and what left out. These are the kinds of things that perhaps they might want to at least set some thoughts down about what would be best practices. Vivek, I don't know if you want to add something apropos of privacy issues.
Yeah, I think on and I sort of see privacy and security as two sides of the same coin, right? And as you noted, Colleen and Bryan, right? There's going to be, I mean, the government has already discussed creating a system for passports for international travel. So I think there's an opportunity here, leaving aside the constitutional questions, for national coordination. It's too bad that it hasn't happened yet. We had an opportunity to create an interoperable system across Canada, and one that would also be interoperable with US jurisdictions. So Quebec has used a standard that's being used in numerous other places in the US to design its app and QR codes. And I think it would be great if there's some federal leadership, at least just in coordinating provincial efforts to deliver that interoperability, right? And I think also the superior resources of the federal government, or the pooled resources of 10 provinces, 3 territories, and the federal government, could lead to a more secure system, right? Combining those resources to make a really secure, well-tested app and verification system would be great.
I'll just add that the federal government has created a smart health card standard, which is based on international standards that the provinces are using to generate their QR code. And this should facilitate interoperability. So I think, as Colleen mentioned, that's going to be critical. The QR codes should be scannable in all jurisdictions. I think the other responsibility they're going to probably assume in some respect is through NACI, create logic for what vaccinated means. And that's going to be changing, particularly as boosters come in and more data on who remains vaccinated and immune. We don't want to have different standards across the country for that.
Thank you. There are all sorts of questions with respect to expanding vaccine certificates to either private businesses or other institutions. So there's a question about hospitals implementing vaccination policies for visitors. So would you think that this is justified?
So there are, in my view, yes, at this point in this time in the pandemic. And I just want to reiterate that, again, that, the justifications that we are discussing here are contextual and time specific. So that's why I say at this point, at this time in the pandemic, and the law and the constitutional justification needs to reflect the context. So where we are basically trying to fend off a fourth wave and the impact on the unvaccinated, those who can't be vaccinated, the impact on our society and our economy and our communities, to me, this does justify requiring both healthcare providers and visitors to hospitals to be vaccinated if they want to see their loved ones. Now, there may need to be accommodations made for people, you know, who there may be very special circumstances why they need to be there and they're not vaccinated. And, you know, I understand that that could be extremely difficult, but I think overall as a policy, that would seem to me, again, on this context at this time, to make sense. You mentioned, Maria, you know, about private entities. A question would be whether these hospitals in this kind of decision making would be considered private. I suspect they would be considered governmental in setting forth this policy. You know, sometimes hospitals are considered public, governmental enough, sufficient for the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and sometimes they're not, depending on what they're doing. I suspect here they would be considered public, subject to the Charter, and thus, you know, would have to defend their policies as being, in these circumstances, under Section 1, reasonable, proportionate. You know, there weren't other measures that they could have taken to achieve their goal. Bryan, did you want to add?
I was looking into this today. I guess you can imagine less restrictive or less infringing measures, like I think Ottawa General Hospital is allowing parents to sort of be escorted into the bedside of their children if they are not vaccinated. And so there may be, you know, that'd be a question of a kind of Section 1 analysis of whether a kind of across the board policy is necessary. So just to Colleen's point.
Yeah, I think some flexibility would have, you know, there will obviously be some exceptions to this rule that will have to be made, I think. And I think what's interesting is that when we discussed this, we're thinking about these policies originally, we thought that there would need to be carve-outs for essential services. And the way that the governments have approached this have not been to define those essential services. They have instead defined what is certainly covered. And then everything else is just excluded, both essential and non-essential businesses that aren't specifically targeted by the vaccination certificate requirements. So it's quite an interesting question, because some of those businesses might be considered essential, and then I think there are, you know, stronger potential charter challenges that could be made vis-a-vis those kinds of things, like access to grocery stores, access to drugstores, access to hospitals, and these kinds of things.
Thank you. There's a question about the sunset clause in Israel, and referring to the timely nature of the measures that were suggesting to put in place. So the question reads: the sunset clause in Israel did not work. They were supposed to shut it down on June 1st, but then they restarted it. And now they're expiring the passports of those who've had 2 doses to encourage people to get a booster. You know, what would be your response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the thing is, though, it's a measure that's been used in response to the circumstances of the pandemic, and the circumstances changed because of Delta in Israel. And, you know, unfortunately for Israelis, the timing of Pfizer 3 weeks after their first shot turned out perhaps not to have been the best clinically in terms of providing protection. And so all of these things, Delta combined with the timing of Pfizer, and Kumanan can speak to this, you know, resulted in a problem. So it seems to me that they reintroduced the vaccine passport, but again, you know, their plan, as I understand it, is not to keep it forever. It is a tool to be used for the purposes of combating the pandemic. And when that is done, then it is put to one side. I don't think that means you can never potentially use it again. That's not necessarily what I'm saying, but that, you know, again, it is only for the specific context, for this specific purpose. It can only be justified in that way. And once that justification wanes, as hopefully the pandemic wanes, then the need for it vanishes as well. Kumanan, did you want to add more apropos of what happened in Israel?
I mean, I think one of the things we recognize as we're developing these passports, they'd have to be agile to some extent because the scientific knowledge was changing, the virus is changing, and they would need to be able to accommodate that. It would be nonsensical to have a static, here's what we created at the outset and we're never going to change it. I think Israel adjusted as further evidence came forward, and they are the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, because they are the earliest rollout and saw what was happening. I think the lessons in Israel are twofold. One is, maybe we need to be a little bit more cautious before removing some of these measures, and both from the passport side as well as the public health measures.
Thank you. There's a question about maybe for Bryan. In Ontario's laws, the government allows for exemptions for medical, but not creed. Should a private business or local government include accommodation for creed as per the Ontario Human Rights Code?
Right. So there's no exemption for the targeted, the sort of businesses that are targeted by the law. So you'd be kind of going above the letter of the vaccine passport regime if you started accommodating religious creeds. I think this is probably quite a marginal concern. I just don't think, as I was saying, I don't think there's a lot of religious opposition to this. But the truth is that earlier on, I was talking about the charter and how the charter has this sort of broad scope for religious protections, but Ontario's protections are actually a little bit more narrowly defined. In Ontario, you actually do have to show that you're part of an organized religion that opposes vaccination. So that makes the case even harder in the province. So I think that, we're in the realm of speculation here, but I think that private sector organizations are okay just kind of bypassing that protection, right?
That's not legal advice, though, Maria. I
Right.
think we definitely, that's not, yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm just trying to see if some questions are answered as we speak. There's a question about privacy law in BC, something referring to something you mentioned, Vivek, in your presentation. In BC, there is the reasonableness requirement, but we also have a section that says, it's section 7.2, an organization must not, as a condition of supplying a product or service, require an individual to consent to the collection, use, or disclosure of personal information beyond what is necessary to provide the product or service. So the question is, what would you say if a customer said to a grocer, hey, it's not necessary for you to ask for my vaccine status to buy some groceries, for instance? Well, in this case, groceries are not concerned with the vaccine certificate, but how would you answer to the necessary component of that requirement, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. So I think, so first of all, if grocery stores were to be, let's answer the question as if it's one scenario is that it's an establishment or service provider that's covered by a mandate, right? There it's easy, as I said, right? Because you could rely on the government saying you have to do this. It's a bit of a harder question for a service provider that is not covered by a mandate. But I think you could make a pretty strong argument that it is necessary, right? The collection of the information, right? That is, I'm looking at your certificate and verifying its validity is necessary in the context of a public health emergency, right? So again, this is where the privacy law analysis piggybacks on the larger human rights analysis as well. Depends on what's the context. Is a customer at a store? Is it employee, employer, right? But once we've answered that more fundamental question about the legitimacy of checking for vaccination status or gating entry on vaccination status, you can sort of answer the privacy law question based on that and say, yeah, it is necessary in these circumstances. But again, one of the principles in privacy law is sort of the idea of data minimization, right? Use as little as you need, take as little as you need, store as little as you need. So there's probably different answers for verification as opposed to retention, right? I think the grocery store would have a hard time saying we need to keep that information in our files for 7 years, right?
Thank you. There was also a question about accessibility. I'm not sure where it is. I can't find it right now, but it was the issue of individuals who don't own phones, who have, perhaps difficulties to track vaccination, regardless of whether they were actually vaccinated or not. So in some cases, I'm just making this up right now. It's not in the question, but I know for homeless individuals, it's actually an issue right now for them to be able to show proofs of vaccination. So how would you respond to that?
Kumanan, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to?
I think you kind of addressed it in there about the creation of using the paper records, and the QR code can be on the paper record. But of course, even for certain populations, that may be hard to keep that track of that record. I mean, that even when I understand when Ontario brings in its verifier app and QR code, they're still going to say you can still use the paper record. So that is an accommodation that's being used in the jurisdictions.
I think, Marie-Ève, it's a good question, and to me, this is I guess the most valid concern about requiring proof of certification, and worries about accessibility and discrimination in enforcement of any requirements for those certificates. So first, there is the concern around access to the vaccines themselves. And I think, that with any program of vaccination certification, that there really is a duty on the government to double down in every way on making sure that the vaccines are available easily and readily to people in hard to reach communities, and folks who find it really hard to, play the Hunger Games that we've had to play in Ontario to get vaccinated in the first place. So I think that's a really important question, that access to vaccines need to be improved. And, as we're starting to think about the under 12s being vaccinated, to me, it's really important that the vaccines be offered in schools as well as in other places to make this easier, as I said. But then the question around discriminatory enforcement, I hope that this won't be an issue, because it's sort of like an on-off thing. Are you vaccinated or not? There's not really a need to scrutinize this too much. But I guess there's always the possible risk that, some vendor might unduly scrutinize the vaccine certificate of a particular individual, and I think we need to be vigilant about that. And then the problem that you raised of people from who are homeless, who just may find it difficult to have any of this kind of documentation, digitalized or otherwise, on their person at certain points in time. So this is a problem generally. I think, though, on the other side of the coin of this, we need to realize that if we don't cut this pandemic off at its knees as best as we can, that the people who will die and suffer the most come from these vulnerable communities again. So that's the other side of it. So as we keep saying, it's kind of not like one thing and vaccine passports and just go back to normal like it was, before COVID-19, before the end of 2019. That's not the option. The other options are all quite unpalatable as well, and they have differential impact on vulnerable communities.
I just want to support that point. Like, let's say a marginalized population does not have access to vaccinations, and as others do, and is not vaccinated, and they still should not be allowed to go into a place where they are at risk. We're doing it to protect them. I mean, I know that's a separate issue. We need to improve the availability of vaccine and the ease at which they can receive vaccine. But the reality is, if they're not vaccinated, they are at risk, and we can't make the justice argument that they should be allowed in and putting their health at risk. So I think we have to keep this from the frame that we're doing this to protect the unvaccinated.
Thank you. I have a question here, perhaps for you, Dr. Wilson. So someone asking about natural immunity for those that have had COVID, and whether those person should be recognized and eligible for vaccine passport, I guess, without getting some other vaccines.
So I'm going to answer this scientifically and pass it on to the lawyers to answer this from a policy perspective. So here is the science. It looks like natural immunity from what we're seeing out of Israel in particular is pretty robust. We don't know the duration, but it seems to be pretty strong. We do know that if you had natural immunity plus a vaccine, you're better than if you have natural immunity alone. So that's the pieces of data we have. From a policy perspective, it gets complicated because if we recognize natural immunity, is there a perverse incentive to get infected? And we heard about the story of the COVID parties in Alberta and then having the people get very ill afterwards. And that's a policy question. So scientifically, natural immunity looks like it worked. We don't know how long. Vaccines work. We're getting a sense of how long. Natural immunity plus vaccines are better than natural immunity alone. So encouraging someone to get a vaccine who had natural immunity isn't a bad idea because we know that's better than natural immunity alone.
Bryan, do you want to answer this one?
Well, I think everything that Kumanan just said is basically would just be fodder for a Section 1 analysis if someone who had natural immunity wanted to challenge vaccine passports on that ground. So, and of course those are all considerations that would be recognized under Section 1, the perverse incentives and so on. So yeah, it's hard to say.
So I mean, initially there was discussion of, before we had vaccines, of immunity passports, and the idea was roundly criticized from an ethics perspective, from a policy perspective, because of this worry that you would incent people to actually go and get infected, and it may be that because there are some consequences to not having the status, that it would also have a differential impact. So I think, to me, that would be not what we would want. And that when we want people to be infected from COVID-19, it is when they are vaccinated, so they have a good chance of fighting it off, and so that they individually won't suffer, but also so that they won't come into hospitals and overcrowd those hospitals. So I suspect there would be a good Section 1 response to that. But again, all the evidence, the context, where we're at in the pandemic, it would all matter on the day, to justify that or not.
Thank you. Interesting question here. I have been wondering about impacts on people whose gender expression does not match the one traditionally associated with their name, because the app in Quebec shows the user's name. And about people, so another component of it, about people who do not have government issued ID, because the app also requires to show ID. So as any one of the speakers come across discussions about those two issues.
I have something to say about this. Not the particular question specifically of people whose gender identities don't match, etc. But if we step back a little bit, right, and we think about identification and identity documents, right, they're a bit of a double-edged sword. There's a huge controversy in India that I think is very informative, not about vaccine certificates, but about a national identity card in India. And the pro of having in a society like India identity documents, a lot of people are not identifiable, right? So they can't access government benefits or get loans. So you need, identity is really important in society, right? To be able to prove who you are. But there's inequities around it, right? And of course, if you're identifiable, then you're trackable too. So it's a real double-edged sword. So there's an interesting literature on identity, right? And sort of the law and politics of identity, as opposed to identity politics, that sort of interrogates that. And one of the things that we learn from it is that when you're designing any system that involves identifying people, you want to be careful about the design, the technical design, but also the uses of that, right? You want it to be minimally interfering with privacy, you want to minimize tracking, et cetera. want to minimize the kinds of information you collect about the person and giving them that. So I don't have a real good answer to that particular problem, but I think it is, and this ties back to the question about the underhoused, right? People who are vulnerable lack all kinds of means in our society, including the ability to identify themselves for any purpose, let alone for proving their vaccination status. So that's sort of a larger equity and social justice issue that we need to address.
Thank you. Perhaps a question coming back to mobility rights. So vaccine pass for interprovincial trains and plane, would that prevent or challenge mobility rights if they were to apply between provinces?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Clearly these kinds of requirements I think would engage mobility rights, unlike some of the other issues where we wondered if, there is really a charter right to go to a bar or a restaurant. I think it's much more clear where it's a constraint on your ability to hop on a train or a plane to cross a provincial border, for sure. However, again, the constraint, the restriction on one's mobility right at this point, at this time in the pandemic, with where we're at with a fourth wave and a virulent Delta variant, and still a good swath of people, the under 12s in particular, who can't be vaccinated, it would seem to me to be defensible under Section 1. So, Bryan, did you want to add anything?
No, really. I mean, there is the fact that there are other ways you can travel through across the provinces and so on. So I think it would just be a Section 1 analysis. I certainly agree that mobility rights are engaged by those requirements, but I think it's a winnable case.
Right now. Right now. So I just want to reiterate that,
Yeah, the timely nature of these measures, I think, is key to this analysis. There's a question about the sort of the balancing between the coercion that is imposed on people to get on with their lives and going out and going for dinner, for instance, as opposed to the fact that vaccine effectiveness is not as high as we thought, and that vaccinated people can also transmit the virus. So how do you do this balancing?
I just want to start by saying the vaccine is still very effective. It's 80%. I mean, that's a very effective. It's not the 95% absurdly effective vaccine, which was amazing at the outset. The vaccine is still effective. And even if you are infected while vaccinated, yes, you can carry it. You are at risk, but your duration of infectivity appears to be reduced. So I just wanted to start off by that. And then let the lawyers deal with the coercion part of this.
Bryan.
Well, I think Colleen sort of touched on this in the sense that that our courts do have a certain threshold of what qualifies as coercion, right? So if for a limited period of time, you're not, like during an outbreak, you're not able to go to the gym. Is that coercion that rises to the level of something that should concern us from a constitutional perspective? I mean, do you want to live in a society where every time someone gets some intrusion with some pedestrian thing they want to do, that this becomes a constitutional matter? I mean, I think the quote that Colleen offered kind of touches on this, of how ungovernable that such a society would be. So I think one of the lessons we need to draw from this experience is that we need to be a little more circumspect about what we want to sort of recognize as a charter interest, right? We've got to recognize that these rules will apply to other people. They'll apply on issues where you're on the other side of things and where you want, where you're the one who loses if the government doesn't regulate something. And so you've got to decide in a principled way what standards you want.
Yeah, I would just add that I think if we were just talking about the interests of those who chose not to be vaccinated, they did that freely, and it wasn't because they couldn't be vaccinated, but they have chosen not to be. If we're only talking about those interests, then I think it's a little bit more tricky. When you agree, Bryan, to make the arguments that we're making. But that's not the case at the moment. Although, we clearly, I think, can make laws to protect people from themselves, and we do. For example, with seatbelts and safety helmets and all these kinds of things. In this case, we are talking about the need to protect others who are also who are very vulnerable. And I think, you know, the courts take that into account. The charter was never meant to be something to be weaponized by those with privilege and wealth. And so when we have, you know, the interests of the very vulnerable on the other side of this, if we don't take appropriate measures to quell the pandemic, then, you know, I think that has to be weighed in. I don't know if you had anything to add apropos of that, Vivek, as well? No? Okay.
I might just editorialize a bit. I mean, there are two spillover effects of not being vaccinated. One is obviously carrying the infection to others, unvaccinated or suboptimally vaccinated. And you know, we're now seeing amongst older people that's potentially a risk. But there's also just overwhelming the health system, as we're seeing in Alberta, and then canceling all of your healthcare procedures, which are then affecting the overall population. And that's a serious consequence. So, you know, I think that needs to be factored into the equation when an entire health system is on the base, you know, is bordering on collapse in a province because of the decision of a minority. You know, again, not speaking as a lawyer, I do think that that's a significant consideration.
Yeah, and I would also just add, I think that you need to, that the courts are very sensitive to the context in which governments have to take and make these kinds of decisions, and that we've seen in the jurisprudence so far around COVID-19. And it is very difficult to necessarily know the impact of certain decisions. You know, to have all the best evidence in front of you is a luxury that is not the case with COVID-19 and an evolving pandemic panic, where things are shifting and changing. So that context, you know, whereas in a normal kind of charter challenge, the courts would likely hold government's feet to the fire, hold them to a higher level, a higher evidentiary standard. In a world where they're dealing with shifting science and unclear results from measures that they take, I think what we see is that they cut them a fair bit of slack.
Thank you. There's just a general question about privacy impact assessments, whether those were conducted at all before implementing those apps.
The answer is I don't know. I'll explain what a privacy impact assessment is. Basically, the idea, and there's a idea that comes from the environmental field. You know, you do an environmental impact assessment before building a mine or a factory. That's come into the human rights field generally, and with privacy specifically. So before you collect sensitive data, et cetera, you do an impact assessment, and you sort of use that as a regulatory and process tool to calibrate what you're doing and make sure that there's not, you know, again, it's part of the process of figuring out, do I have a legitimate purpose? What I'm doing is proportionate to that purpose. I don't know if impact assessments were done before the apps themselves. I think it's a great idea for governments and developers to do them, to share those results. And I'll say that, you know, more generally, this is an area where transparency is incredibly important. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of transparency with regard to the development of the apps, auditing them, their security, right? Just being very public about that. We saw that with COVID Alert, the contact tracing app at the, you know, earlier in the pandemic, that there was, I think, a fair amount of confidence in it because it was all done in the open. And I think we should do the same thing here.
Can I editorialize a bit?
Sure.
I mean, one of my frustrations with this whole thing is, you know, we did advocate for this in the spring of 2020, and it was sort of squashed because of ethical concerns, legal concerns. But the argument I always made was there's going to be a lot of scientific, technological, and privacy security barrier that was going to take a while to resolve. And this was inevitable. We're going to need it for the vaccine. So we should we had started earlier, a lot of things Vivek's mentioning, we could have started to address well in advance, as opposed to almost reactively now having to create a solution, which is unfortunate, because the contact tracing, that's a great example. There was a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. We did it the right way. If we could have rushed out the wrong way to do it. And so the same with this, if we had taken, I think they're doing it the right way, but we did have a lot more lead time where we could have worked on these.
Thank you. There's a question about schools, and in particular high school or elementary schools, or not universities per se, and about schools, forcing vaccination mandates on their grounds, and refusing some of the exemptions, for instance, based on religion or creed, and forcing unvaccinated students to go online. So the question is whether would the student have protections under the Human Rights Code to stay in school in person? And obviously, again, saying that this is not legal advice that we're providing tonight.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and one that I have started to think about, but I haven't fully thought it through. And I think we need to do more analysis on this. But again, it will depend on where we're at in the pandemic, whether or not we need mandates in schools. And so, hopefully the first thing that we would do would be to make sure that everybody who wants to be vaccinated is able to be vaccinated. So I just reiterate that I really don't think we should roll out the Hunger Games for kids like we did for everybody else. And I really feel that it's imperative that we get vaccines offered first in the schools. And then, I think you have to assess the situation then. Is it needed? Do we need to require vaccination of kids at this point? And so that will just depend on where we're at in the pandemic. And there are some complicated ethical issues to think through, because kids can be impacted by COVID-19. They certainly are a vector for the disease. They transmit the disease to others. So they, it's not like there's some sort of magical unicorn that don't do that. But the ill effects for them are usually, quite a lot less. So, if we're at a point where we're saying we need the kids to be vaccinated because we need to get our rates still up to X percent, I think this is a more complicated kind of a question for us to debate and to consider at that point. But I think what we would do first is offer it to everybody, just as we did. We didn't do it very well, but give everybody a chance to be vaccinated, and then we'll see how we go. I think Kumanan has some thoughts too about. I see someone had a question about how to approach the hardcore anti-vaxxers and how you do that. I wondered if you want to talk about your idea there, Kumanan, apropos of education of kids and things. You're on mute, buddy.
The kids one's tough, right? Because it's a surrogate decision as opposed to you making a decision for yourself. You make a decision for yourself, you lose the access to the amenities of life that we decide. And for kids, it's a much tougher one, because the kid is suffering for a decision made by their parent. There was a question about denying care to a non-vaccinated, and I'm glad someone put the CMPA thing, and I understand there's probably a nuance amongst. For kids, you definitely can't do that, because the kid didn't make the decision not to get vaccinated. So the doctor needs to look after that kid, and that kid's at the highest risk. Communicating with these people is you have to find out where they are on the spectrum. Are they hardcore anti-vax, or are they vaccine hesitant? And addressing a vaccine hesitant person like a hardcore anti-vax is going to drive them into the hardcore anti-vax. It's going to so we have to be careful with that. With respect to school policy, that I think exemptions. Again, it comes back to, we have these policies, at least in Ontario, BC to an extent, in New Brunswick, for a bunch of other vaccines. And, we were asking people to be vaccinated against diphtheria, and it's a whole lot more COVID now than diphtheria. And the policy is pretty straightforward. If there are cases at school, you stay at home for your protection. Like this is a standard of care policy. We're doing it to protect your child. And now with online learning, that's quite viable.
Thank you so much. There's also a question from a law professor in the US who focuses on biodefense and public health law. So that person followed the 2003 SARS outbreak in Canada and was impressed by that action was taken to establish a specific Department of Public Health with federal power. Unfortunately, we in the US still use the old model with the CDC as advisory to states having almost complete jurisdiction over public health law matters. How did Canada benefit from or use the new department with the COVID-19 pandemic, and has it been as envisioned?
The answer is briefly no. So first of all, the Public Health Agency, doesn't have power in the way that has been construed by the person posing the question. It is more in the nature of advisory. The powers, it's possible for the federal government to assume more power than it has in the context of a pandemic emergency. It has decided not to do that. And if it had done that, perhaps it could have used the Public Health Agency to direct things more, but that hasn't been the case. So our story has been one of differential provincial response, and unfortunately, the great joys of federalism, where we see outstanding efforts in one place and then we mimic them. The idea is that we level it up then for everyone else. I would think we would say we've probably had very mixed results in that regard through COVID-19. But I think that'll be a post-match analysis that we'll spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out what worked and what didn't work in terms of federalism and our approach across Canada. And then I think, we will have to discuss whether or not the Federal Emergencies Act is really fit for purpose. It's certainly my reading of it. It doesn't even really, it would be pretty much useless in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So does that need to be rewritten? So when we do actually have an emergency, we can actually declare an emergency at the federal level. We were the only country really in the developed world that didn't do so. Does anybody else want to jump in on that? Bryan or Kumanan is also, funnily enough, an expert on federalism amongst his other.
I think you've articulated it well.
Okay.
I mean, the US issue with the CDC is there's a federalism issue, and then there was a marginalization issue, given the political circumstances at the time. But the CDC has had influence through its spending power, and FAC hasn't had that same kind of ability.
Yeah, and we should note that, from the time of SARS in 2003, the dollars that the federal governments and provincial governments have put into public health, and particularly in this case, pandemic planning, have waned over time. And we have a general kind of institutional problem that public health isn't very sexy, it's not very political. Pandemics, seem so far off on the horizon. Who could have imagined really that this would have happened back in the beginning of 2019? There are a few people anticipating it, but no one really listened, politicians or the public. And so, in the wake of COVID-19, we will have a storm of commissions, reports, activities, and funding. But unless we do something systemic and long-term and structural, in another 20 years, we could be right back to where we were just as we started into COVID-19, unprepared and not ready for what was to come. So yeah, we need to do some hard thinking about structural institutional reform.
Thank you. We still have a few minutes left. There's a question on the medical side to see if what kind of accommodations we should provide for people who are exempted from vaccination for medical reasons in the healthcare, so that they can access safe care in light of the transmission of the virus. For example, can there be areas that are where they are kept separate, or special training for staff in hospitals? And
so I mean, I made an effort to answer that a couple of times, but you know, vaccination of healthcare workers and guests goes a long way to achieving that. We are all wearing masks. That drops the reproduction of about 30% in and of itself. You know, if and again, I just want to reiterate the exemptions, that there are going to be very few people who meet the exemption criteria. But you know, for those very few people, the safest thing for them to do is to wear an N95 mask. N95 masks really do limit. This is now recognized as largely being airborne, and the N95 mask will protect those individuals.